Well, good evening to everybody in Kabul. Good morning to everybody in America, and good day to everybody in Europe or wherever you are. Welcome to this particular roundtable, which comes at a very important time, at a very critical time, I believe. We have a very distinguished set of panelists and speakers with us today. And this roundtable is with the Afghan Institute of Strategic Studies. The roundtable will discuss the feasibility of transition from NATO-led mission to a UN-led mission in Afghanistan. And we have a very, very distinguished set of speakers with us. We have Ambassador Omar Samad, former Afghan diplomat, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. We have Ambassador Said Akbaruddin, former India's permanent representative to the United Nations. We have Dr. Hu Shisheng, director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Studies. We have Dr. Temo Antro Kivimaki, I hope I got it right, professor of international relations at the University of Bath, United Kingdom. My name is Tamim Asi, and I'm chairman of the Institute of War and Peace Studies. I'll be moderating this very important discussion today, and we will discuss the feasibility of how a UN-led mission can take over from NATO in view of the recent proposal by the United States for an expanded and enlarged and maybe more authorized role for the United Nations. And it could not have come at a more proper, appropriate time. Let me thank the Institute of Strategic Studies, as well as our panelists for being with us. I should also put a disclaimer that we invited 3 female experts to this panel for our audience who could not make it, but we will strive to have female speakers in future. With that, let me jump right into the discussion and ask Omar Samad to give us an assessment of the Doha peace process. He has got 5 to 7 minutes. Please, Ambassador Samad, over to you if you could discuss the pros and cons of the Doha peace process so far.
Thank you so much. My greetings to everyone. My thanks to you, my friend, Mr. Ossi, and to all our colleagues at AISS for putting this together. It is, as you said, a very timely topic. There are 2 very key words in the topic that has been chosen here, the word feasibility and the word transition. And obviously, the institutions that are involved are key institutions as far as what is happening now in Afghanistan and around Afghanistan, but also what will be happening if the feasibility is correct down the road in the next steps towards an Afghan settlement, as most of us hope and expect. As far as your question is concerned, Mr. Ossi, in regards to the Doha process, in my view, at this point, at this juncture, is on hold. The peace talks obviously have been stalled for a while, especially with the incoming administration in Washington and the fact that they announced that they are reviewing Afghan policy. They have inherited a somewhat controversial package from the Trump administration. There were some achievements as part of that endeavor and initiative that the Trump administration had engaged in regards to Afghanistan. And there were some lingering questions and some, I would say, some skepticism that went along about how this process can go forward and how it can achieve some of its goals and how you can tie in all the different elements of a very complex scenario that has several different drivers in trying to achieve a comprehensive end game for Afghanistan. So obviously we all know that this involved not only talks between the Taliban and the Afghan state, as I would say, representatives of the post 9/11 order, but it also has a lot of involvement having to do with what the United States and the Taliban agreed to, because that was the first, after a year and a half or so of discussions between the two sides, they came to an agreement, which was signed in February 2020. That agreement in itself has raised a lot of questions, but has also opened new discussions and new pathways to go forward. So it's a mix of, in my opinion, pathways, as well as a mix of unanswered questions and work in progress. And then there's also obviously the issue of a ceasefire, how, when, under what conditions you agree to a ceasefire that is executed and can be implemented and can be monitored and all of that. So you have all these different elements as part of the US-Taliban agreement. And then obviously there was much more work that needed to be done. Now, there was a change of political order in Washington. And so with the new administration, everything was put on pause. I think that the fact that the Doha process, the Doha talks were put on pause was somewhat natural, because you cannot go forward, or at least for the Taliban, who had an agreement with the US, it became very difficult to go forward with the talks while Washington was trying to figure out whether to stay, whether to leave, whether to extend its mission, and how to deal with what was inherited from the Trump administration. Right now, as we are speaking, we are, I think, at another juncture. And this new juncture obviously has to do with the latest documents that have been shared and have been leaked in the past few days in regards to what the US thinking is moving forward. We have a letter that was leaked that shows that the US administration has certain views on and expectations on how to deal with the political roadmap on Afghanistan. And there's a document that sort of is a draft document outlining what the future could look like, what a future arrangement or power sharing structure could look like. And these are very important documents because it feeds into the process itself at a time when Doha is on hold. There's very little going on in Doha. But I think Doha is going to be revived in the next few days, I think, but in a different way. So I expect a lot of activity around Doha again. I think that Ambassador Khalilzad, who is doing a bit of shuttle diplomacy right now and is back in the region, may decide to reinvigorate Doha, but in a new context. And the new context has been defined by these two documents that we discussed. So there's a focus on an international conference in a few weeks, a very optimistic or very, very ambitious goal. A lot of talks to regional powers, neighborhood powers, and actors, as well as Afghan stakeholders. So the ball is rolling in Kabul. There's a lot of talk in Kabul between the stakeholders on how to react to the new American proposals, and there are different positions that are being staked out at this point. And the region will now have to take position on the new American thinking. And I have to say, nothing is concrete and nothing is final. It's work in progress. So we have to look at this as an initiative that has been launched. And obviously, they have to manage it in order to reach some of the goals that they have. So I don't want to go further into this, but this is my view of where the Doha process, as you asked, sits. And I think that there will be more dynamism, and I think there will be more activity around Doha, but in a very different context, different from what we have seen it in the past few months.
Thank you, Ambassador Samad. Thank you for that assessment. Let me jump now to Ambassador Akbaruddin. Given his experience at the United Nations as India's permanent representative, how do you see the role of the regional countries, and also how do you assess a potential for an expanded UN role in the Afghan peace process and in the Afghan developments right now. Given that there were, in the 1990s, when Dr. Najib was in charge, you had been in Savannah and the UN, brokering a deal which really went, it was a disaster as far as Afghans were concerned. So in the context of that particular experience, how do you see an expanded UN role, and then the role of, how do you assess the role of the regional countries, what they can do for the Afghan peace process? Ambassador Akbardin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asif. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to be with this, be on this distinguished panel. So I'd like to thank the Afghan Institute of Strategic Studies for this opportunity. Now, let's go one by one. Choosing horses for courses is a good thing. The only thing is you have to be certain that the track on which you're choosing a horse fits the horse. So let me try and explain what I think about these options of going beyond the NATO to a UN role. Now, there are certain advantages that the UN has. It's a platform which is globally acceptable. So it can bring together diverse interests. But you've explained an instance where the UN wasn't successful. And I could perhaps add to that, peacemaking is a difficult proposition in the best of times. And for the UN, that track record hasn't been very successful. Let's go back to some of the issues which the UN has been dealing for decades. Let's take Cyprus. Peacemaking is still working more than 50 after the UN was the primary actor. Also, Afghanistan is a very complex situation because not only is there peacemaking, but there are elements of counterterrorism involved. Now, look at the UN's experience in counterterrorism. Just let's take Mali. You have nothing less than an extremely difficult situation which has been exacerbated. And the UN Secretary General himself has mentioned that in situations like Mali, where counterterrorism is required to be an intrinsic aspect, perhaps UN is not the best tool to work. So we need to be very careful and cautious when we say we would like to have a UN-led process. What it means. Certainly, there is UNAMA already in Afghanistan. You could expand its role. Certainly, as the US has indicated, there is a case where some of the regional powers can sit together on a platform and work, and that's not new. The JCPOA, before it came into being, was part of an outcome of the E3+3. The talks in North Korea had 6 parties to that effort. So bringing in a broader number of stakeholders is a good thing. So if I were to try and quickly recap, I would say that yes, there needs to be a platform that the UN provides to be used, but we need to be very cautious in giving up systems which have worked reasonably well, not to the satisfaction of everybody, but reasonably well, and launching into an area where difficulties could perhaps be manifold. Yes, we need to have regional actors, and regional actors can perhaps agree on some consensual decisions. For example, all the actors could perhaps agree that there is no going back to an Islamic Emirate 2.0. All those regional countries and others who were involved could come up with some sort of a broader principle agreement which can help the Afghan parties to work together. In fact, ultimately it will be the Afghan government and the Taliban who have to work. And I would just like to point out, while I've heard Ambassador Samad talk about the Doha deal, one of the critical shortcomings of the Doha deal was that it did not provide for restrictions on violence against the Afghan population. And therefore, what we've seen is that even while withdrawal timings were worked out, even while other issues were being discussed, it had provided an opportunity for face-to-face talks, but violence against the Afghan people have mounted. And that is a major flaw in the discussion that we've had over the last 1 year. Of course, hindsight is 2020. At the stage when it was discussed, perhaps this was not configured in, but going forward, this will have to be configured in any system that you want, whether it's the UN, whether it is regional, whether it is a continuation of the present process we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that explanation. Let me now jump to Dr. Kivi Maki. Also correct me here. How do you assess the Doha process, and then how do you see the role of UN in terms of being a capable broker in a post-Doha process, both at from a regional perspective, what kind of role UN can play in the region, and also beyond? Please, Dr. Kivmek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tamim Masei, and also thanks for the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies for inviting me to this interesting panel. Now, let me start with the UN ability to handle situations like this. Two of my latest books have looked at unilateral operations in violent, fragile states like Afghanistan and UN peacekeeping. And if I could show some graphs of that, because it's quite clear that the UN has been quite successful in reducing violence in fragile states. For example, if we look at the level of fatalities before, during, and after an operation, we can see that unilateral operations like non-UN operations tend to fail. The majority of operations actually fail both in reducing fatalities during and after operations compared to the levels before operations. However, in 2/3 of UN peacekeeping operations, fatalities have already started reducing, and they have been lower than before the operation, and up to 86% of UN operations have left the host country better off after the operation. Some 2/3 of unilateral operations by US, UK, France, and Russia have left countries worse off after leaving. Now, the reason why I think UN has been quite useful is one thing. One of the reasons is clearly what has just been mentioned here, that UN has the kind of legitimate platform as an organization that Afghanistan also belongs to. Nobody can say that it's unilaterally imposing solutions on other countries because other countries belong to the UN. Now, this is also different between the UN and the US, that US often comes with solutions, and in the Afghan process, in the Doha process even, there has been agreements that the US has made with Taliban that commit Afghan government, and that to some extent offers or kind of supports this idea that US, I think US approach has been quite constructive, but it has nevertheless been one where it has offered solutions rather than just facilitated discussions. Now, UN seems to be quite successful in facilitating discussions, and if one correlates approach which gives ownership to the host country, the conflicting parties, and the results in terms of fatalities, there seems to be a clear correlation between the approach that gives ownership to the conflicting parties and the reduction of fatalities. And this is one of the explanations why I think why UN has been very successful. The other thing is that it's also, its approach is more, UN approach has always been more dialectical. I mean, it has aimed at increasing dialogue rather than enforcing solutions on others. Now, even within in some cases, UN does try to enforce solutions, and it tends to fail. I have calculated actually that whenever it has enforced what it considers humanitarian law, it saves almost 28,000 lives less during operations than in cases that it focuses on fostering dialogue. So this, together with the fact that UN tends to focus on more soft aspects of human security, has made it extremely successful, and this, I think, explains why it tends to succeed where unilateral powers like the US, UK, France, and Russia tends to fail.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for that assessment. Now, if I could call on Dr. Hu Shisheng, and can you, what do you think? How China assesses the role of the regional countries in support of a UN-led mission or an expanded UN-led mission in resolving and providing the enabling environment for the Afghan peace talks, and where does China stand on that based on your assessment, or how do you see it? Over to you, Dr. Shisheng.
Thank you, Chairman, and also thanks the invitation from Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies. Very glad to join this wonderful team to have a discussion on this very still ticklish issue. As for China's view, I think that at least China as a regional country and as a neighbor of Afghanistan, China is very glad to see that the UN play a bigger role, or even major role in the coming days, because just as the two ambassadors and also the professors mentioned just now, is that it is UN is really welcomed and accepted by all diversified powers or with diverse interests, because UN is a more legitimate platform, especially regarded by the regional countries. So if in the future the UN will play a bigger role than the NATO, I think that the regional countries will be more, how can I say, favorable in accepting this kind of transition or change. but also, frankly speaking, that there is visible differences when we make some assessment about the functioning of the UN on Afghanistan in future and up to today's performance of NATO, US NATO, we can see there is a visible differences. With NATO's functioning here, there is clearly a very powerful leader. So we can see that the NATO's actions with more binding forces, with a clear leader, so sometimes will be more efficient. Although that the Afghanistan issue is still in a big mess. But comparing to United Nations, I think the NATO platform or institution, we can imagine it will more efficient than the UN role in the future. Especially that the UN can only play a soft role, mainly maybe on the coordination by convincing or consultation, not like the NATO or the US that shaping the or implementing their plans in a more forceful way, or even shape the future of Afghanistan or create a new kind of scenario in Afghanistan forcefully, but which United Nations may lack that kind of efficiency and resources to implement. What the UN is facing now, we're making the UN role in the future more how can I say, more difficult, because what we can see now that the Afghanistan issue is the reconstruction of Afghanistan issue is still in a big mess. There's not a very encouraging progress in the past 20 years, except some political reconstruction, except some demographic changes in Kabul or some urbanization in this country. But this, anyway, the situation now, comparing to the situation 20 years before, is still very discouraging. So that will, that is to say that we should be more patient when we encouraging the UN to to play a bigger role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan in the future. If we want the UN to be more efficient, at least we would better support that the UN have more resources or more capacity in imposing like sanctions, of course, when it's necessary, based on majority, not based on consensus. Even without a sanction, I don't think the UN will make any big difference comparing to the NATO. But of course, the major purpose of this kind of sanctions will preventing external interference into the peace process or any kind of reconstruction of Afghanistan in the future. And as for what kind of fields where UN role can mean something, I think that it could be demonstrated in the following some areas. Firstly, that is, the UN can play a role in narrowing down the differences of the of the two parties or in the peace process. Secondly, that through the major power coordination, that to encouraging all the major powers and also the Afghan neighbors to sign a certain kind of guarantee document. The purpose of this kind of guarantee document is that to safeguard, to guarantee that all the parties should observe the results of any peace process or impose sanctions on any violation by whatever country. The third is that the UN also should be a facilitator in the peace process, so that to prevent any peace process in the future to come into a deadlock. The fourth role that UN could create a certain kind of environment that to convincing all the parties involved that there were no other way out of the current disorder except peace process, peace talks. But of course, it will need UN to, while cooperating with the major powers, the neighbors of Afghanistan, and also with some multilateralism like NATO, SCO, OIC, that to convincing Taliban that to abandon the goal of total military victory, even after a full US withdrawal, and instead to engage in serious, sincere negotiations with the Republic side for an early political settlement. And also the UN should also maintain such kind of promise, commitment that any future assistance being combined with the process of the peace process. This should be a commitment, especially the commitment in the post-peace agreement. In economic terms, in military terms, the UN should play a major role in this regard. Of course, that we know that even there are some successful stories in the past when we're talking about the UN's role in coordinating the battlefields in some other regions and areas. But when we read in the history in this region, especially on Afghanistan issue, ever since the 1980s, although we noticed that in the 1980s, UN also play a major role in helping the Geneva Agreement being reached finally, but we now understand, see that that kind of efforts hasn't created a lasting peace in Afghanistan. One vivid example is that we know that in 1997, when under the UN efforts and also combined efforts from Pakistan, the Rabbani, Taliban, and Dostan has entered into a ceasefire agreement. That is on the January 14th. But on the very next day, the Taliban and the launching military process, then the how can I say, firing again. So we can see the limitations of the United Nations. So when we encourage United Nations to play a major role, we still will value all the parties, the major powers, the neighboring countries especially, and also the regional multilateral institutions like the OIC, SCO, even NATO. Yeah. So you should not let UN alone to play the role, because UN still lacked this. I just stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There is a famous saying that UN is as powerful as its member states, or as much as you empower the UN to be and give them the right capabilities. I think that is a good transition for me to ask a very important and pertinent question from Ambassador Samad. Given his long history, because he has been before the Taliban, before the US intervention in Afghanistan, he was also part of the different delegations, Afghan delegations in various peace platforms, negotiations, and he has either been a part of it or observed it. But then also he has been our ambassador to at least 4 countries, and he knows Afghan complexities. How do you think the UN can be a good mediator and facilitator in between the Afghan parties as well as the regional countries to play an important role, not only facilitator, but also an enforcer, as well as a monitor in terms of various parties. Over to you, Ambassador Samad.
Thank you very much. We have learned and we have heard a lot of very valuable insights from the three other discussants, and I appreciate that. And to your question, Mr. Ossi, you see, we have to look at first the feasibility of moving from one paradigm to another at this point. You see, we haven't moved yet. We are talking about what might happen and what are the best case and worst case scenarios if it shifts from this more military-centric structure that we have dealt with in the past 20 years to a more political-centric structure, which the UN could reflect and represent. Because a multilateral platform versus something that is more limited in scope and has been in terms of counterterrorism over the past 20 years, and some degree of course, political work and diplomatic and nation building, state building, and all of that involved. So you see, we are right now talking about this shift that has been somewhat pushed by the United States as the main actor, the elephant in the room over the past 20 years. And what does it say? So it hasn't happened yet. We're having a discussion about it. We don't know what shape it will take. We don't know even if it will happen and it will happen the way that we think it might happen. So there are a lot of questions at this point before we jump to a scenario where we think it is going to happen. Because there are countervailing forces right now. There are different viewpoints on how to shape the next steps. Look, there are different reactions to the two documents that I mentioned earlier by the United States in Kabul, and there are, I'm sure, different reactions to those documents in that perspective that is being offered in the region and globally as well, and with stakeholders that are involved with Afghanistan. But what it means is that the United States has made a strategic decision to shift, and this strategic decision has been taken quite a while ago. We're trying to adjust to it now. The Biden administration is trying to adjust to the reality that we cannot pursue a military solution in Afghanistan. That is no longer an option, really, unless everybody leaves and the Afghans fall back inside their own sort of shell and continue fighting, which would be the worst case scenario of civil war, proxy war, what we saw before 2001 in one way or another. And so the focus should be right now on how to avoid that scenario or a new version of that scenario from happening. And I think this is why the United States at this point is trying to say, we are gradually going to reduce the military focus through NATO, the focus that we've had through NATO and the US military, and we are going to shift to a civilian, political, diplomatic perspective and pathway. And I think this is a huge paradigm shift. And this is being managed right now. And so there are different forces that are trying to pull it to one side or the other right now, both inside Afghanistan and the region and beyond. So we haven't really reached the UN stage yet. So what the US is proposing is that the UN become more of a player and become an umbrella and become a platform as we move towards an international conference, something that it might be in Ankara or maybe wherever else, or maybe Doha is going to continue in some other form. We're not sure yet, but Turkey has been mentioned in the US document. So as we move towards a UN role, a much more important UN role, we need to take into account where we stand today and what are the next steps moving towards that direction and moving towards a bigger UN role and shifting gradually away from NATO. And then there's a big question of what will be the NATO role in the future? Is there going to be a NATO role in the future?
Yeah.
And how are we going to shape counterterrorism? Ambassador Akbaruddin mentioned that this is an important consideration for many countries, including Afghanistan, as to how are we going to shape counterterrorism and security issues that other countries are concerned about, including China, for example, and the United States itself. So there is a lot of commonality, in my opinion, from a diplomatic perspective, that can be worked on in order to shape this new paradigm and shifting from a military-centric approach to a diplomatic political approach, which is very critical at this point.
Yeah.
The problem is we have very little time to do all of this. And the problem is that we don't have consensus yet. So you have to use the time that you have to build consensus both inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. And you have to do it in a way that does not damage, for example, the agreements that we have, so that one party all of a sudden says, I'm out. So if the Taliban say, I'm out, then what do we do? So this is a huge question. Or if Kabul, if there are deep divisions in Kabul, and Mr. Ghani says, either I stay or it's my way or it's nobody's way, then what do you do with that? How do you deal with Mr. Ghani saying it's my way or no way? And so these are some really critical issues that have to be taken into account. I think that I'm more concerned about Afghan politics at this stage than I am about how the region is going to deal with it. So I will stop here and let the others also.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Samad, for that. It's a good transition for me to ask Ambassador Said Akbaruddin the same question, but with a little bit of a tweak, which is that there are, as Ambassador Samad mentioned, there are talks of a Turkey-style Bond 2, where the UN calls for an international conference, and then countries will sit down together and try to force different parties to come to reach some sort of an agreement, given the urgency on the on the US side. But also UN gives the platform for all of these, adversarial countries like Iran and US, and I don't know, Russia and others, to sit down around the same table, just like they did it in Bond 2. How do you see the potential to that transition? And do you think UN, an empowered UN envoy like Lakhdar Brahimi could do, or I mean, but like an empowered UN envoy facilitating an international conference, let's call it Bond 2 or whatever you want to call it, do you see UN could play that role? Does it have the capacity and the credibility? Because a lot of people now question also the Bonn agreement and the Bonn conference, because they say, well, Taliban was not included, and as a result of that Bonn, we have this current situation. Please, Ambassador, over to you.
So thank you very much. I think the situation today is much more complex than it was in 2001. 2001 and the Bonn conference was, in a manner of saying, conference of the victors. There was a, of course, serious attempt at intra-Afghan working out differences, but there were not two parties in that. Also, not two parties with such sharp differences. And militarily, there was no issue at that stage in 2001 about the military consequences immediately of any outcome. And therefore, the focus was largely on the political outcomes, the constitutional arrangements, the societal. Today, it's a much more complex situation, because the fault lines are sharper. Also, the situation of so many major powers being involved in this has grown. And there have been many gains in Afghan society since 2001, which many people would like to be preserved. And we do not know, as Ambassador Samad just said, we do not know the reactions of the key players. as he said, in Kabul, there are two views coming out on this, and we haven't even heard from the Taliban side of what is their view on this. So the situation today is much more complex. Now, does that mean that it's not feasible to have a facilitator moderator? No, there always is scope for such things, but these things take, given that you have 90 days to a withdrawal of the US, I think the first requirement will be, even as you work on the intra-Afghan issues, the first requirement will perhaps be to work out on the security issues of that the withdrawal willy-nilly will have to be extended. How it's extended, etc., you can work out, but I do not see in the 60 or 70, maybe 80 days that, or even less than that, the 60 days perhaps, that you will come to a solution of all the moving parts. And there are many moving parts. It will require a superhuman effort to get to that solution. And I wouldn't blame any mediator, any negotiator, any forum of having such superhuman powers to get to that goal quickly. So perhaps we need to break them down into easier, manageable elements before we move forward.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Ambassador. Let me ask Tim, Professor Tim, if I could call him that. Do you think that what will happen to the military aspects, like CT, the counterterrorism aspects of the mission in Afghanistan? Because NATO has that comparative advantage of the military aspects of it. In terms of a UN role, would they be able to carry out that CT mission? You're in favor of a more political wing of the activities given to UN, and NATO continues to do the CT part of it in another arrangement. So basically, giving the political aspects of the Afghan peace process to UN, and then leaving the hard military to the NATO. Is that a feasible way, given your experience and your extensive research? Please, Professor Penn.
Thank you very much. I mean, the short answer is that it's not a feasible way to leave the counter-terrorist operation to the NATO and continue as I mean, otherwise as a UN operation. Now, very often we criticize UN in situations like this because it doesn't have the kind of robust military power that NATO, for example, has. One of the arguments that we could say against that view is, first of all, that NATO, that UN does have a better capability after the United Nations General Assembly resolution in 2001 that made the funding of peacekeeping operations automatic. So situations like we had in Rwanda or elsewhere in the 1990s, we cannot imagine anymore because of the fact that it is possible to mobilize a Security Council authorized peacekeeping operation. Now, one of the things that we have to remember is that much less power is needed if there is a solution or a process to a solution which is indigenous. If you want to impose your own solutions, you need a lot of power. That's why NATO, for example, needs a lot of power for its solutions, and yet it seems that that fatalities increase in NATO operations. And so you need less power, and in that sense, United Nations may be more useful. At the same time, you do need power to enforce already agreed solutions. Now, would it be possible then that there's a kind of a hybrid operation with NATO and with the UN? Now, if we look at the track record of the UN has failed in those 35 countries it has operated with a peacekeeping operation after the Cold War. It has failed only 4 times. Those 4 failures have been Mali, Syria, Central African Republic, and of course Rwanda. Now, what is common to 3 of the 4 UN failures? What is common to them is that in 3 of those cases, namely Syria, Mali, and Central African Republic, there has been a unilateral great power operation simultaneously with UN operation. So we don't have a good track record of that kind of a solution where UN does the legitimization of the process and then big power imposes its will with military power. So that I don't think is going to be a viable solution. At the same time, of course, I understand what others have been saying, that in a landlocked country with a lot of mountains, you cannot move forces in or out very quickly. There needs to be a kind of a transition period.
Thank you, Professor. Now, I would like to ask a question from Dr. Shishing. The Afghan peace talks has been primarily a binary format between the Republic and the Emirate in the context of the Afghan peace negotiations in Doha. And a lot of people are now talking about making it multi-party talk, both from a regional perspective, as well as from intra-Afghan talks, in order to be more inclusive, because that would make the deal more sustainable in some people's views. That the more inclusive and broad-based internally in Afghanistan, the parties are a party to the talks, and the more inclusive the region is party to the talks, then there is that sense of ownership. And they feel that they're party to the talks, and they would be, whatever deal is reached, both from a regional consensus as well as national consensus point of view, will be much more sustainable rather than having a binary or a bilateral or multilateral or a trilateral format. Your views on that, Dr. Shishing, please.
I think the peace or the lasting peace of Afghanistan depends on 2 major aspects. One is that the internal unification on the major concern, major issues which concerned by all the different parties. If without that kind of consensus, like on the formation of the future political system or the state system, like whether it's emirate or whether it's republic, I think anyway there should be a consensus internally. Even at the present, some kind of new initiative from the US, like on the whether interim government are needed or not, they should also need the internal consensus in this regard. So on the other aspects is that the regional countries should also have consensus on major issues concerned respective players in this region. If without their general consensus, then the Afghanistan issue cannot get rid of external environment. Or if the Afghanistan reconstruction cannot get rid of regional external involvement or interference, there will be no lasting peace in Afghanistan. So they need 2 kinds of consensus. But of course, it's very, very, very difficult. Why it makes difficult? Because that the outsiders sometimes also want to play with the differences, play one card against the other, have more, more higher strategic, how can I say, motives in this regard. Just regard Afghanistan as a how can I say, as a proxy war places for there to meet their respective interests. So that will make the issues more complicated. That is why in the past 20 years around, even US with such a powerful military forces and economic resources and such kind of powerful alliance culture, still cannot make very impressive progress in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. So in the future, if UN want to play a different role to achieving a more different, how can I say, process, I think the most important thing is that how to reach a certain kind of understandings and agreements among the regional powers to not to interfere into the internal affairs. If without any external involvement or interference, I think the Afghanistan people can find their way out. That is, the outsiders, including the regional countries, it is better for them to play encouraging role, encouraging the Afghanistan themselves to addressing their problems, not how can I say, not to play cards or not to take usage of the internal differences. But it is easy to say, very difficult to how can I say, to implement. That is also why I said that under the UN framework, they should how can I say, organize an international convention that reach a certain kind of agreement that to have some more resources or necessary documents to imposing sanctions against any parties who violate the agreement. That is to how can I say, to punish any parties who interfere into the internal affairs of Afghanistan. But still, I am not so, how can I say, so certain about the future if there is a transition from NATO model to UN model. I still believe that the UN model and the NATO model should be a complementary one. There should not be one to replace the other. Even the NATO model, I can say that is still under the shadow of the US. So that is to say, the US should still be there. Should still have one of the key to the future of Afghanistan. If US totally get away from this issue, it's still the future of Afghanistan's reconstruction is still full of uncertainty. So it should not be one way or the other. It should be a combined one.
Thank you, Professor Shisheng, for that incredible elaboration. Ambassador Samad, this is a very key question, as Dr. Shisheng put it out. Or is UN and NATO complementary or substitute? Are they made for, they have different expertise, and those expertise, based on those expertise, they have to work. There's also a legacy question for NATO, that NATO has invested so much in Afghanistan and they would like to keep that. But then there's also the question of the future funding for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, which I'll come to Professor Tim in a bit after you, which UN, I don't think UN could manage a trust fund in terms of funding. I don't know if it's in mandate or they have the expertise of managing funds for armies or for police or for security forces. So my question on that specifically is, are the UN and NATO substitute in terms of their missions or complementary? Do they have different skill sets? Should it be all totally UN because the NATO one, all totally NATO didn't work? How do you see that? And then the future of funding for ANDSF, how do you see that within the context of the UN as well? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. I think that we have to move with time, and we have to move with circumstances and reality on the ground. So there was a reality in 2001, and we tried our best to move with that. We saw what some of the flaws were, some of the fault lines were, some of the mistakes, huge strategic mistakes and huge tactical mistakes over the last 20 years. I am one of those who was talked and written quite extensively about learning from our past and learning the lessons, the hard lessons from Afghanistan. If we do not learn the hard lessons, we're going to repeat them, and then we don't have anybody to blame but ourselves. So there's a role for different institutions and different platforms at different times, given the conditions and the circumstances. Just because NATO was there and has to be there for many more years, has to be justified, has to make sense. And it has to have Afghan ownership, Afghan endorsement, because this is about Afghanistan at the end of the day. This is about the Afghan people at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, they have to buy in and they have to endorse any type of external, whether it's assistance, funding, whether it's military, whether it's civilian, they have to really be part of it. And others have to find commonality with Afghans on this. So let me offer something a bit different. Yes, there obviously is a role for the UN to play. Yes, there may be some type of a hybrid role for NATO to play down the road. Again, given the realities on the ground and Afghan endorsement and consensus all over, a broader consensus that is needed. But let me say that as we move forward, we realize that there is a need for an enforcement mechanism. And we're all talking about these enforcement mechanisms in terms of agreements, in terms of commitments, and in terms of specific functions that have to be performed. Let's say we discuss CT, for example, or ceasefires, truces, how to reduce violence. All of these require maybe some kind of a framework and as well as a mechanism to make sure that it sticks. Let's come up with something new, maybe. Maybe if there is an Ankara conference, maybe they will realize that there is a need for some type of mechanism, and maybe it can take on an Islamic flavor. Let's say that we say that it's a hybrid where Turkey can play, for example, as this is a pure speculation, that Turkey can have a lead role. Why? Because it's an Islamic country. Afghans maybe perceive it differently, and they react differently to it. It can play both a UN, put on a UN hat, a NATO hat, and an Islamic hat. So I think that there are always ways to find solutions that are more practical in today's context for a situation like Afghanistan. And we really need diplomats. I think the diplomats have a role in trying to figure out these solutions and offer new alternatives and new options. And good diplomacy and good, making sure that you have learned your lessons from the past and knowing that where you stand today and also knowing where you want to be tomorrow. So once you have defined those, then you get everybody on board to the extent that you can. Now it can come from one country, it can come from a set of countries, it can be a 6+2, it can be a UN initiative, it can be a Chinese initiative, anything, or an Indian one, as long as we have options and alternatives and solutions toward what I think is the most important aspect of all of this, is ending a war, a devastating war, and moving this country and this region toward a more peaceful, stable future. That is the goal. And we need to be mindful of terrorism and spoilers. We need to be mindful of all the negative aspects of this and how to mitigate those. So I am one of those people who's always focused on trying to find a solution to a problem and putting it in a different context. So we have to be somewhat creative with our thinking, And we don't have to continuously repeat the same models. And we have to learn from the past. As the professor said earlier, we have to learn from other cases. So you have success cases in some countries, and you have failed cases in other countries. But then Afghanistan is a case by itself. And you have to look at Afghanistan, obviously, in the context of Afghanistan and the region around it. So I hope that in the next few weeks, in the next few days, actually, since again, time is of the essence here, in the next few days, in the next few weeks, we will be we put this project of ending the war in Afghanistan and moving towards a stable future on the right path. So the most critical thing is, if you do not put it on the right path, and if you don't bring all the elements that to bear on it, then we may face an uncertain future, which is what we should avoid at all costs, in my opinion.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ambassador Samad, for that discussion and for your response. Now, I would like to ask Professor Tem, but as we are getting towards the end of our program, I request everybody to keep their responses short, within 2 to 3 minutes. I know these are difficult questions, will require time. But Professor Tem, the question to you is, I heard you before saying that, well, UN mission under a power will not work out. But then, do you think, sort of the same question, that UN and NATO could be complementary, substitute, and then also, do you believe that the UNAMA mission is enough, or you think it should be a much more expanded mission with a new special envoy, kind of an empowered super envoy, to be able to spearhead a lot of these challenges and tasks? What is your views on that?
Thanks very much for this question. Actually, I realized my previous answer was a bit too blunt. What I think doesn't work is that UN offers justification, like in Libya, for example, and then NATO offers agency. It didn't go well that way. Another thing which doesn't go well is UN operates, and then there are independent unilateral powers, like in Mali, which doesn't work either. At the same time, NATO participation in UN missions that are led by the UN has been very positive. And in Afghanistan, of course, they have accumulated a lot of expertise. So I do think that there could be, I mean, not just assistant mission like we have now. I think there should be a peacekeeping mission, UN peacekeeping mission, and operations that NATO countries and the US would then conduct would be under UN rather than the other way around. I think this way would work.
Well, thank you for that precise, succinct answer. Ambassador Said Akbaruddin, over to you. In your experience, do you think we need to look at a much more expanded envoy UN mission with a new UN Security Council mandate and a super envoy to spearhead the efforts? Because everybody is talking about the fact that, well, UN will be as empowered as the UN Security Council, and member states provide them the equipments and the resources. You know better than I do that the UN, for example, peacekeeping missions around the world always struggle with resources, with equipments, with consensus amongst its members. And oftentimes they fail because they don't get the political mandate, the resources, and the capacity they require. Do you think that, first, so the question is, do you think that there's a need for an expanded, revised UN mandate, and then a super envoy, and then the resources, you think they will be able to get those resources to get the job done, or it will be just, as some people perceive it, US getting out and kind of subcontracting the problems to UN, and then eventually it fails, they could blame the UN too? Please.
Thank you very much. So very quickly, the UN cannot substitute the NATO. So we'll have to be very clear. Its skill sets are very different. Peacekeeping in Afghanistan is not a UN possible mission. We just have to accept that. It's not a choice there. It's just a necessity that peacekeeping in Afghanistan cannot be done by the UN. India has participated in 50 peacekeeping operations globally. We are well aware of what the shortcomings of peacekeeping operations are. Peacekeeping is a band-aid that you try and hold on to when other solutions are being worked out. So what I would suggest is, yes, an expanded mission is indeed the way to go. A greater political role for the UN is indeed the way to go. A greater funding from the UN is also the way to go for these missions, but not a peacekeeping mission. Peacekeeping of the type that the UN does is not of a robust variety. Yes, it is true that in some cases, missions have went out, but that necessity, as Ambassador Samad said, you have to look at both these options, UN with a political face, UN with an expanded role in terms of norms, in terms of rules, in terms of assistance in constitutions, etc. and all. But in terms of peace and security, it will have to be a different model than the UN, a peacekeeping role. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ambassador. A quick question to you before we move on and ask everybody to wrap up, Dr. Shishing. There are certain people who are saying that if NATO B-52s and F-16s couldn't force the Taliban and other parties to abide by their commitments, what does the UN have? I mean, sanctions, yes, but Taliban regime was one of the heavily sanctioned, governments on probably planet Earth in the 1990s. Beyond sanctions, what are the tools UN could have to force parties to abide by their, commitments? Your thoughts on that?
Besides sanctions, I think the UN can also play some. So one is a punishment. Another way is awarding. If you obey it, there will be more, rewarding, or some bonus from more helpful cooperation. So there's two. One is a carrot, one is a stick. So the UN can have that. That is my answer. But still, that sanction really means something. Like why the Taliban the leaders want them name get delisted from the list. It functions. It has some functions. Of course, such kind of sanctions, especially from the UN, get support. Yeah, the support from the major powers. It is more powerful. But in the past, this kind of sanction haven't been used on Afghanistan issue. But we can see the effect on Iran, for example, very effective. On North Korea, of course, also effective. So that is why I said that sanctions is one of the way. Also, there is also a bonus, like the rabbit. Yeah, in another hand, can do it. But once again, just want to repeat the final opinion that it should be a complementary role played by both UN and NATO with US behind. And also we have to learn the lessons. Why the US-led NATO mission not so successful in the past 20 years? I think one of the reasons is that there are some hidden agendas behind the US, which causing the regional powers suspect. They have no trust upon the NATO's or US paradigm. While with the UN, upholding the UN banner, this kind of mistrust will be reduced. in a more, how can I say, impressive way. So put NATO's mission under the UN framework, I think is one of the very good way in the future.
Thank you, Professor. You know, there's a famous saying, with all due respect to our UN colleagues, everything that doesn't work, give it to the UN. But maybe we will have to see if the UN could reverse that this time. But speaking of the bonuses, I think the time has come for everybody to wrap up their speeches. So please, 3 minutes, and I will start with Ambassador Samad. Please, 3 minutes, wrap up and your concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. It's been very valuable to listen to all the participants. Let me just quickly say, Afghanistan right now is caught between a rock and a hard place. As a result, all the stakeholders obviously are feeling the pressure. There is a unique opportunity, historic, I think, unique opportunity right now with a very short window to find some type of way and pathway, as I call it, towards a settlement. It's not easy. It's not, as a matter of fact, it requires a lot of work. It will be to some extent time consuming. It has to have different steps. It has to be coordinated. It has to have consensus, as we all discussed, from all the major stakeholders, and we have to build that consensus and solidify that consensus. It has to both internal and external. And this opportunity, as I say, is historic because if we do not grasp it, if we do not make good use of it, if we do not really value it, I think that the options, the alternatives are really dire, not only for the Afghan people, but it's going to be dire for all those who have been involved over the past 20 years in so many different ways, from China and India to the United States and Europe, and Islamic and non-Islamic countries, from Japan to Canada. Everyone has pitched in, everyone has contributed in one way or the other. But unfortunately, the Afghanistan issue has not been resolved. And it's actually in a very different place than we imagined it. I imagined it 20 years ago. So we need to deal with reality. That's the other lesson. We need to deal with real options and real solutions. And we do not need to turn it into a battleground. We do not need to turn it into a proxy battlefield. That doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. It may work for one or two parties for a day or two, but in the long run, it doesn't work. We need a permanent solution to the Afghan problem. Afghan people, Afghan elites, Afghan so-called leaders have the first responsibility. I'm very critical of them because I think that they have failed Afghanistan badly. Not all, but most have. And that we need some new thinking. In Afghanistan, we need a new movement, and we need new leaders who can think beyond small scope. They can think big scope. So there are a lot of things that have to be done. And at the end, we cannot ignore all the forces. We cannot ignore the Taliban. The Taliban are a reality. The Taliban are in control of parts of Afghanistan. The Taliban have support systems not only outside of Afghanistan, as we know, but they also have support systems inside Afghanistan, whether we like it or not. And we need to come to terms as Afghans eventually. I am a firm believer that Afghans, including Taliban, and extreme views that exist in that society, can over time, through peace building initiatives and political initiatives, can come to terms on what can work best for all of us. Not perfect, not 100%, and obviously not something that one side, winner takes all. It's not a winner takes all situation. And at the end of the day, war and militarism in Afghanistan and continuing that path hasn't served anybody well, some people have made a lot of money out of it and they've benefited from it, but the Afghan people, the region, and the potential that we have as a region has been hurt. I think this region has tremendous potential economically, from trade, to investment, to resources, to moving people and goods. It has amazing potential, and we really haven't made the most of it. And I hope that our international partners will realize this, because it helps everyone from China to India to Turkey to the Arab states and Central Asia and our neighbors. Everyone benefits from this. So let's aim for a win-win situation instead of a lose-lose situation. That is my message. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Samad, for your concluding remarks. Ambassador Said Akbaruddin, over to you for your concluding remarks.
Peace in Afghanistan has come up on the agenda very early in 2021. And it's also a test case for the international community to show whether there are scope for cooperation, or we will fall back into what we have seen for the last few years of a global order which is in dysfunction. On the other hand, so it's a test case for the countries beyond Afghanistan of can they cooperate, but also for the Afghan people. I mean, I'm a great follower of the Afghan cricketers, especially in Test cricket and in the IPL. And they have been extremely successful at any other team in the world. The Australians got their first victory after about Afghanistan got it in less than 10 years. So there is skill sets available among the Afghan people. If you have it on the cricket field, you also have it elsewhere. So there is hope. All we can do is to wish you all the best and hope that the international community also can contribute in some small ways. Ultimately, the choice is of the Afghan people. They have the skill sets, they have the opportunity. The choice is theirs, of course.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that upbeat concluding remarks. We really needed that. Thank you, appreciate it. Professor Tim, over to you for your concluding remarks.
Thanks very much. I would conclude that the evidence suggests that that there is a need for a stronger UN security role. UN has succeeded in 31 of its 35 countries where it has had peacekeeping operations after the Cold War. It has succeeded in very difficult countries. It has succeeded to reduce violence and increase state capacity in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Liberia, Mozambique, Sudan, very, very difficult and complex humanitarian situations. Now, the most common argument against UN role is that UN doesn't have the robust military power that the NATO has. NATO has not managed to create much peace with robust military power. And in Afghanistan also, if people have a horizon to a genuinely indigenous solutions and genuinely indigenous processes where outsiders do not push their solutions, that's when less power is needed. If Afghanistan manages to get ownership of its own peace process, if the process is focused on dialogue rather than enforcement of already accepted norms, and if it focuses on the real problems of people, which are often economic and poverty related, I think then Afghanistan has a good future, and the transition towards a more representative international involvement would be possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tim, for those concluding remarks. Professor Shisheng, over to you for your concluding remarks, please.
I would like to say that China even more eager than the US to see peace, lasting peace in Afghanistan. In several aspects, one is that China's Belt and Road Initiative in this region. Also, the China-Pakistan economic corridors progress in the future. Even China's Xinjiang stability and development, and even China-US cooperation in some area. Now, although we can see the confrontation between the two countries too tense, in the past, before Trump, that we at least have one area to cooperate, that is Afghanistan issue. So in the future, of course, whether we can, it is more hopeful or possible that under UN framework, China and US can find a platform to cooperate. So it would be very encouraging. That is also why I said that China is more eager to to see a bigger role of UN in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. So it is time to give UN a chance in this in this way, in a new era, especially in the post-COVID-19 era. Just like Professor Timo mentioned that this region, the international community focusing or encouraging the focus on poverty, on unemployment in this region. Otherwise, there will be no peace, not only in this region and also beyond, because we call it the heart of Asia. Afghanistan is the heart of Asia. If the heart with some problems, then the whole Asia will be problematic. Then the whole world will be problematic. So let's have some hope here. I'll stop here. Thanks for invitation. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you, Professor. With that positive note, this was a fantastic discussion. We covered and analyzed all aspects of a potential expanded UN role. Of course, we all wish the UN well as the different regional countries, and we all strive for peace in Afghanistan. But let me particularly thank the Afghan Institute of Strategic Studies, Dr. Muradian, our colleagues at AISS for giving us this platform and the opportunity to discuss this. And I hope our audiences enjoyed and used and found this particular discussion useful. I thank you all for being great panelists. Thank you very much. I think we are probably the only panel which finished on time, which is great. Maybe 2-3 minutes before. But again, thank you so much, everybody. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good night
Thank you.
from China. Good night.